Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our fifth and penultimate session of the fall series for Earth Day Every Day. My name is Sal Mangiafico. I'm with Rutgers Cooperative Extension of Salem and Cumberland counties, and I'll be hosting the webinar this evening. Rutgers Cooperative Extension is the outreach arm of the university. We conduct public education on a variety of topics, including topics of environmental concern. And every county has an extension office, so if you have questions for us, feel free to find your local extension office and pose those questions there. The theme for this fall's webinar series is The Winds of Change, Environmental Impacts from an Altered Climate. And this is a partnership between the Earth Day Everyday group and the Marine Extension Program Seminar Series. And we do have some co-hosts with me online as part of those groups. So tonight, I'm very pleased to introduce to you Dr. George Hamilton, who is the Extension Specialist in Pest Management with Rutgers Cooperative Extension. He provides pesticide safety education and conducts research on pesticide usage patterns in New Jersey, as well as research into biological control of insect pests on ornamental plants, as well as the biology, ecology, and management of the brown marmorated stink bug. So tonight the talk will be an invasive insects update, including the spotted lanternfly, emerald ash borer, and hornets. So you can go ahead to the next slide, George.
Okay.
Okay, thanks. So at the end of the talk this evening, we're going to launch a poll that'll ask you some questions about what you've learned this evening. The university does consider this to be research. So as part of this, there's you'll be asked a question to consent for your responses to be used as research. Go ahead to the next slide. And of course, Rutgers Cooperative Extension is an equal opportunity program provider and employer. If you'd like further information on this, there's some contact information on the slide in front of you, or feel free to reach out to any of us, and we'll provide you that contact information as well. So that being said, and without further ado, I will turn it over to, one important thing I didn't mention. If you have questions, please put them in the chat, and then I'll wrangle those questions and pass them on to George at the end of the talk. Thanks a lot, and without even any more further ado, I will turn it over to George. Thanks.
Okay, great. Thanks for the introduction. So yes, I'm an extension specialist. I'm in the entomology department at Rutgers University. I've been faculty for about the last 30 to 35 years. And over that time period, I worked with a lot of different insects, everything from the Colorado potato beetle and the European corn borer to looking at different types of predatory and parasitoid insects that are attracted to flowers in the landscape and how to use them to plant to attract those things into your yards and so forth. But in the early to late 1990s, I became involved with an insect called the brown marmorated stink bug. And since that time, most of my work has actually been focused on working with insects that are invasive in the Northeast. And so as mentioned, I'm going to talk about three, the emerald ash borer, which hopefully everybody's heard of, but if not, I'll give you a little introduction to it. The spotted lanternfly, which I'm definitely sure everybody's heard of because it's relatively new in our state. And then I'll end by talking a little bit about the northern Asian hornet. Actually, that should be the northern giant hornet, and I'll explain that when we get to that. And so, since I do work with invasive species, one of my pet peeves is that most people don't really understand what an invasive species is. Most, and especially those in the press, think about an invasive species as something that is new to an area. Well, that is partially true, but when an insect like the brown marmorated stink bug is introduced into a new area, as it was in around 1995 here in the Northeast, um, the big question is it invasive or is it just a non-native species? And there is a difference. We consider a non-native species to be something that's moved outside of their normal geographic range, usually via human actions. And they don't really have any kind of impact on native ecosystems. And so all they're really doing is getting transported from one place to another and outside of their native range. Now, for something to be invasive, it has to actually cause some kind of ecological or economic impact. And so, in the case of the brown marmorated stink bug, that impact was economic. And in the years where we had extremely large populations here in the Northeast, it caused millions of dollars of damage in tree fruit in the East Coast. And so that makes it invasive. If it had never gotten to that point, it would just have been another non-native species that we had here in the East. Now, these insects and other things, because it does include weeds and diseases and all sorts of other things that you can probably think of, um, are greatly aided in their range expansion and how fast they invade. And so we are definitely responsible for a lot of these things that come in, whether they're non-native or eventually become invasive. And in some cases, they actually cause other kinds of problems. Not only do they eat our native species, but there is potential for hybridizing with the native species. And so that causes a lot of impact. Now, I'll give you an example, couple of examples. This is a beetle. And of course, the question is this actually invasive? Well, if you live in the southeastern United States, um, you would not consider this to be invasive um, from a standpoint of introduction because it's a native species in the southeast. This is the southern pine beetle, and it feeds on the southern yellow pine, and it can cause very extensive damage in plantations and the forests down there. Now, in the early 2000s, this insect started moving north because of changing weather conditions, and it eventually got to New Jersey, and it became a problem uh, here in New Jersey in our forested areas, especially in areas in the pine barrens. And so, yes, this is invasive, but it's not actually from outside the country. It's a native species that has changed its range. Many of you might know this one. This one has been in the news for about the last year or so. This is a Joro spider. It was introduced into the southeastern United States in Georgia and has been slowly making its way up to our area. And I think, if I remember right, the last report was it had made it possibly into Delaware. And so it's coming our way. It is being moved around by humans. But again, the question is it invasive or is it just an invader? Well, this insect so far, no one's been able to show that this has had any kind of economic or ecological impact as it's moved into this eastern United States. And so in this case, we wouldn't consider this to be invasive. Now here's the brown marmorated stink bug. I've already told you that this is invasive. This insect is native, if you don't know it, to Asia, and it has been introduced into many other regions in addition to the United States and Canada. It is present down in South America, It is present, unfortunately, in many countries in Europe. Um, and it is also hasn't made its way there yet, but they're very concerned about this getting into Australia and into New Zealand. And so, in the areas where it has made it into to the area, say for example Europe, it is considered invasive, and that's because of the damage it does to crops, and it's done a lot of damage to crops in northern Italy, in like us with their fruit crops. Um, and it's also invasive because of the nuisance factor that many of us are aware of, uh, with it coming into our homes in the this time of year and in the winter time. Now, this is just very quickly the pathway of invasion. Normal, what happens once they get here. There's a series of things that has to happen for them to actually uh, make it and survive in the new area. And transport is the big one. It has to actually get here. And so that's very easy for things to do these days. But once it gets here, the first thing that has to happen is, can it survive? And if you think about when things could come in, if it comes in at the wrong time of the year, it may actually be too cold and it can't survive here. Or it may be at a time of the year when there isn't any food for it to feed on. And so if that happens, it's highly likely that it's going to die and won't move into other areas. But then if it does get introduced, next step, of course, is, will it establish? If it establishes, it's then, will it remain local? Is it going to get anywhere, say, with the initial invasion of brown marmorated stink bug? Is it just going to stay in the Allentown, Pennsylvania area, or is it going to get to other places? A lot of the times, that's what happens. It stays there. It doesn't move into other areas. When we hear about it is when it does. And of course, we know that the brown marmorated stink bug has spread to almost every state now here in the United States. Although spread doesn't mean an impact. And so then, what is that impact? And it can be low or it can be high. That's sometimes human perception. Um, but it's also economic as well. And so this is just a very quickly a graph just showing the number of non-native introductions that have happened since 1850. And as you can see, we have had a large number and an increase in the number coming in on a yearly basis here in the United States. Now, part of this is because of transportation, and hopefully you can see my cursor. 100, 200, 300 years ago, the mode of transportation that something would be on to get into, say, North America was a wooden ship. Actually made it very difficult for things to get here just because of the length of time that it took to get here. Today, our transportation systems are much faster. Our boating, I got a picture of a large ship here, a cargo ship. It takes a couple of weeks as opposed to several months to get here like it used to. One of the things that also helped 200 years ago was ballast that was used in those wooden ships. That's basically material that's put in the hold of the ship to kind of act as a counterbalance to keep it from tipping over. And when they get to where they're going, they would take that out, dump it on the shore, and fill it up with whatever cargo they were taking back to, say, England if they were here in North America. And so what was in what they took out, it was usually soil and rocks and things, and anything that was there had a chance of establishing here in the United States. We still see that. On the lower left here, I've got a picture of water being emptied out of a cargo ship here. This has been responsible for things like zebra mussel getting into the Great Lakes, and so this is frowned on today. Even quicker way to get here, and we think this is how things like the brown marmorated stink bug got here, is aircraft, where something can be in a shipping container, put on a plane, and moved to the United States or North America within 24 hours. And so that makes it even easier for things to have the potential for establishment here. And so we've had numerous come into the United States since 1900. And as I mentioned, lots of things, insects, diseases, weeds, and other types of organisms as well. And they come from areas you might not expect them to come from, and they come in things you might not expect them to come in. And so if you up at the Port of Elizabeth or at Newark Airport, especially in the airport, if you're in the international, you might see a dog with a handler walking around, and most people think that they're looking for drugs. They're actually looking for agricultural products that might be brought into the country illegally, and the concern is what's in those products. And so I've got pictures of things that were shipped in. You've got ham there and all kinds of other things there, but also something as simple as a shipping container not being dealt with properly, treated or debarked at where it came from, and it gets here, and all of a sudden we've got a new insect. And so, if you're familiar with Asian longhorn beetle, that's how it got here to the United States. And the same thing with the emerald ash borer. It came in most likely in wood that wasn't properly treated before it came here. So that leads me into the first insect I want to talk about. That's the emerald ash borer. And so this is the adult. It's a very colorful insect. It's a metallic wood boring beetle. That's the common name for the family of beetles that it belongs to. It's very small, as you can see. That's one sitting on a penny to give you a scale of size. But given its small size, you might not expect it to be all that damaging. But this insect is very destructive to ash trees, and every area that it has entered since its initial introduction into Michigan in 2002, it has been very destructive. Um, and so it's moved around since once it got here in nursery stock and in firewood. And so in states where it's been found, they actually have quarantines about moving nursery stock to other areas out of quarantine areas or even firewood. And so if you do any camping, you've probably been to a campground where there are signs you cannot bring your own firewood in, you must buy it from us. Well, that's to keep things from like emerald ash borer getting into other states. Same thing with nursery stock. Before it got here, anything coming into here either would have had to been treated and inspected or not allowed to come here. And not everybody follows the rules. And in fact, Maryland, their first infestation was because somebody shipped nursery stock from Michigan to Maryland, and it didn't do what they were supposed to do. So it made it into Michigan in 2002. After that, it moved to Ohio, and then it showed up in Maryland. It showed up in Canada, right there next to the Michigan border. Then Indiana, Pennsylvania. It is in New York State. It's in Delaware. And it entered New Jersey in 2014. And so it's been here about 10 years now. This is just a map that was created by our Department of Agriculture. They do monitor for this insect, and they have been tracking its spread since it made it in 2014. And so all the colored areas, except for the yellow areas, are where we have known populations. Okay. And so it's in pretty much the whole state. These areas represent most of the areas where we have ash trees in the state. And that makes sense if you're familiar with Ocean and Atlantic and Cumberland and parts of Burlington County and Camden. There's a lot of pine trees, but there's not many ash trees there. And so it is actually spread throughout most of the state. The larvae, after they hatch and bore into the tree, feed on the cambium. And so I've got a picture here of the larvae. It's very easy to identify, at least as being a metallic wood-boring beetle. It's got a white body, and then it has a big brown, looks like a ball for a head. That's different than all the other ones that can attack different trees here, like the Asian longhorn beetle. It's a totally different looking larva. Um, Again, they feed on the cambium. You can see the trails of feeding here on this tree where they've removed the bark. Um, that feeding girdles branches and trunks, and it interferes with transport of materials up and down the tree. And eventually it kills the tree, and the tree dies from the top down usually, because they usually infect the small branches. Um, that larvae will feed. It'll go through a series of instars or juvenile stages. It then will pupate, just like a butterfly or a caterpillar, under the bark. And then when the adult is ready to emerge, it chews its way out, and it leaves this tiny D-shaped hole. And you can, by the point of the knife, you can see how small it actually is. Mating occurs, and then the females go and they lay more eggs on host trees. And so this is the result. This is very typical. As I'm driving around New Jersey these days, I'm seeing more and more of this. So you have an ash tree that it's basically dying from the top down. It does have some secondary growth that's appeared on the tree, but eventually this tree is probably going to die. And depending on where you are calling in from, um, we have this problem right here in Middlesex County. You can go over to Thompson Park and see lots of dead ash trees. Up in Morris County, Great Swamp, or Penn State Park, or County Park, excuse me. We have a lot of that. Somerset County, if you go along the Raritan Delaware Canal system, the park there, the trails, especially in the Brownswells, the Blackwells Mills area, you will see lots and lots of dead ash trees, and this is becoming more and more common in the state. So you see dead ash trees. The other thing you can see are the lots and lots of emergence holes on the trunk eventually, and then there's also a sloughing of the bark off the tree, as you can see here on the right hand picture. So as I mentioned, the Department of Ag does have a survey program. This type of program's been put into a place in every state where it's come in, where basically they locate the population for the first time. They go then identify likely areas for establishment or introduction in other parts of the state and start surveying. When they find them, it goes into a state and a national database. And then our Department of Ag did, as other states did, a lot of outreach and development of education materials. One of the things you want to look for if you have ash trees that haven't been attacked yet, is an increase in woodpecker activity. So again, the larvae are under the bark, and that is something that is seen um, increase in not only the numbers but the species of woodpeckers in an area. And then, of course, looking at the start of the declining trees. In some states, and I'm not sure they've actually done this here in New Jersey, they will create trap trees. And so that picture I showed you where they removed the bark, that is actually a tree that they deliberately girdled, because when that happens, the tree actually gives off chemical compounds that are attracted to the beetle, and it attracts the females in, and they can use that as a monitoring tool for movement into new areas. Eradication is done, and in a number of states, especially Indiana, in places like Indianapolis, they had whole programs where they went and cut down all the ash trees to trying to keep it from spreading and creating ash-free buffer zones. People have removed trees in large areas here in New Jersey, but I don't think at the level we've done in other states. Um, One of the main things here is to limit man-made movement. And so again, prohibiting the transport of firewood or even just the trees as they're cut down into uninfested areas. And so we did have that in place here. It is possible to move things, but if they're going to move, they have to be chipped to less than 1 inch or burned. And that was something they actually did with the Asian longhorn beetle when they cut down all the trees in northern New Jersey around Newark Airport and as far down as Woodbridge. Um, they would cut the trees down, and then they would take them and they burned them to use to generate power, which is good. There are insecticide treatments. You can do foliar treatments. There are a number of materials. You can do trunk treatments as well. Um, but they are only really preventative tactics. We don't have something that we can wipe out a population completely. And that's partly because of the fact that the larvae are under the bark. And so the foliar would actually be targeting the females, trying to get them before they lay eggs. And then the trunk would be done with a systemic material because that would get taken into the trunk and distributed throughout the tree. Now, they have identified 3 parasitoids. These are tiny little wasps, and they have been released here in New Jersey. And so these tiny wasps are parasites of the larvae. And so the females are able to deposit an egg into the bark and into the cambium directly into one of the larvae that are there, with the intent that the egg will hatch, and then the larvae that comes out, the juvenile wasp, then develops on that emerald ash borer larvae, pupates, and then chews its way out of the tree and goes off and attacks more larvae. So here's the first one. This is Tetrasticus planipenense. It's native to Asia. And again, I'm going to show you a map. They have introduced this into New Jersey. Here's another one. This is Spathius agrilli. Again, they've introduced this into New Jersey. And then Spathius gallinae. And so just to give you a scale, these are very, very small insects. And so you need a high-powered microscope to be able to actually identify these down to species. That's how small they are. Here's that map that I mentioned. And so the areas where you see the stars in the various counties, Those are the release areas. And so what those are various county and state parks here in the state where they've released this. And so one of the things that we're doing in my lab, the Department of Ag hasn't been able to go back to some of these sites and evaluate as to whether or not they've established. So I spent this summer uh, walking through the woods and parks in Middlesex, Mercer, and Morris County, in some of the parks there, checking traps that we put out to look for the parasitoids. And unfortunately, at least in all but one area where we sampled, we were not able to recover any of the parasitoids that had been released. That doesn't mean that they're there. They just may not be in the location where we were looking. And so we were looking at the exact site where they released the parasitoids. They may have spread out. And where we were, they've already killed all the emerald ash borer. And so we're going to continue to do that this summer and move traps out further into the woods to see if we can pick them up. So here's the current status. They're found throughout New Jersey. It's very easy to spot the impacted areas wherever you drive around in the northern part of the state and see lots and lots of dead trees. It's probably dead ash trees. It is possible to protect specimen trees. One of the ways you would do it with a systemic material, inject it into the soil or into the trunk of the tree. One of the materials that is recommended is the use of a neonicotinoid insecticide, either imidacloprid or dimethifuran. We are not allowed to use those materials as of October of last year here in New Jersey. So this isn't something that you yourself can do to a large old tree on your property. The state law does have a provision where for specimen trees, it is possible to get a waiver, but it's something that you would have to hire a company to come in and do for you. You can't do it yourself because we can't buy those materials anymore. Okay, I'm going to switch to spotted lanternfly. And if you haven't seen one, you're one of the lucky ones. This is the adult spotted lanternfly. It is very colorful. It starts to appear late in August, and it is around throughout almost into November, although this year it's probably still out because it hasn't been cold enough to kill the adults. Very, very colorful. A lot of people confuse this for a moth or a butterfly because of the coloration. It's native to northern China. Over in Asia, it's also invasive, like it is here in the United States, in South Korea, Taiwan, Vietnam, and Japan. And it has a preference for feeding on plants that have high sugar contents, and that has a big impact on what it feeds on. So this was found for the first time in Berks County over in Pennsylvania in 2014. And the Department of Ag there went into a quarantine situation and started an eradication program to try and continue to spread throughout the state. Unfortunately, as is the case with a lot of these invasive species, they still manage to spread. And so this is the situation in terms of quarantine areas 3 years ago in Pennsylvania. And so they've spread through a good part of the state. We had our first detect in Warren County in 2018. And if you can see the red in the middle of the star. That's the 2018 detections. It actually was found around this time. It was came in with a Christmas tree. It must have had an egg mass or two on it. It was cut down and over in Pennsylvania, brought to the people's home in Warren County. And the heat in the house actually caused the eggs to hatch. And all of a sudden, they had all these little live ornaments running around on their tree. They were smart. They called the Department of Ag. Department of Ag went up. They took care of it. They eradicated the individuals that had been introduced or hatched. And that was what triggered us looking for it here in New Jersey. And so in 2018, they actually set up a 3-county quarantine area with Warren County, Hunterdon County, and Mercer County. And they started looking for this insect. And as you can see, by 2009, it had spread to 4 other counties here in New Jersey: Somerset, Burlington, Camden, and Salem County. And so these pictures kind of document the spread of this insect. And so these are from emails. So we set up a website, and the Department of Ag had their own as well, asking people if they saw this insect or they thought they saw this insect to email us a picture and tell us where you found it. And so you can see that in 2018, it was pretty much restricted to just Hunterdon and Warren County. It started to spread out in 2019, and it was moving southward and moving east. And then by 2020, at least in the areas where we first saw it, it had spread quite a bit. And so, as most of you know, it's now found throughout the whole state. And so here's the progression. 3 county quarantines in 2018. They expanded that to 10 in 2019 and 15 in 2021. Here's the current quarantine area. And again, everywhere but Cape May. Now, that doesn't mean they haven't seen them down there, but there are no, last I heard, there are no known established populations in Cape May. And that's probably related to the type of foliage, trees and so forth they have down there. Okay, we are not the only ones. Pennsylvania and New Jersey are not the only states that are being impacted. This is just a regional map. And it has made it as far south as North Carolina and as far west as Ohio, Michigan, and Indiana. So it is spreading out, and there's a lot of people that are concerned about it. Here's the life cycle. Females lay egg masses. They look like brown, fuzzy masses on the trees in September. Those, depending on where you are, the eggs start to hatch in May and June. And then they go through a series of 4 instars. The first 3 are black and white, and they get larger as they molt to the next stage. When they molt to the 4th instar, they are very large, and they become red background with black and white spots on them. And then, starting in, I said late August, it depends on the year and the temperature, anywhere from late July through December, but usually it's in August and runs through October. Those adults are maying, and the females will lay eggs until they either run out of eggs or we get a hard enough frost to kill them off. So they have a number of hosts that they will feed on. This is actually unlike the the emerald ash borer, which is confined to just ash, this is actually kind of common with invasive species. Brown marmorated stink bug has well over 100 different hosts here in the U.S. that it will feed on. This one prefers tree of heaven, black walnut, and grape, silver, red maple, river birch, and willow. It has been reported to be found on conifers, but they don't do really any substantial feeding on conifers. The important trees are the ones they can complete development on, and I've listed them there. Number one is tree of heaven, followed by black walnut. Um, and so if you've never seen a tree of heaven, it's also an invasive plant, introduced many years ago from Asia. If you drive along our interstates, you will see lots of these trees. If you don't know what it looks like, if you see here, I got a picture of the flowers. They turn yellow, and you'll see this in midsummer. And then later on, when they produce the seed pods, those seed pods are turned reddish brown and dark brown, and you can see them in the trees. The leaves themselves actually are somewhat similar in pattern to sumac, and so people do confuse it with sumac. Here's just black walnut, and so I'm not very good at identifying trees, so I use the nuts themselves. So when you start to see those large nuts, that's actually around the time that the lanternflies start to go to the trees. Here's river birch, and here's willow. Okay. Wild grapes also has a role to play in the life cycle of this insect. They will feed on this as juveniles, and then they leave and go feed on other things. And then late in the season, they will come back to it as both instars and adults and feed on the wild grapes. And so this is actually a problem. And you probably, just because it's a grape, figured out what that problem is. And so I'm going to jump to the bottom of this slide and agriculture. And so wine grapes are a potential problem. Now, these insects don't actually feed on the grapes themselves. They feed on the vines, and they remove large amounts of fluid from the grapevines. And it's been observed, at least over in Pennsylvania, when they're in large numbers in the fall feeding on the vines. In the springtime, the vines do not leaf out and actually die. And that's because of the removal of all the resources from the plants, from their feeding. If you look at that grape, the cluster of grapes, you can see all the little brown spot or black spots on them. That's due to not the feeding of the lanternfly, but the excretions of the lanternfly. So they move a lot of fluid through their bodies. They can't handle it all. They don't need it all. They just need the sugars in it. And so they excrete lots of liquid material. We call it honeydew. And so that honeydew then accumulates on things. And in the landscape and also in the forest, that's where the big problem is, because the large amounts of honeydew get on the understory. There's a mold called black sooty mold, and that's what you're seeing in the picture of that grapevine. That if it's large enough will actually interfere with photosynthesis and cause dieback of the understory. But in grapes, it's not direct feeding on the grapes, although that sooty mold makes those grapes unsaleable It's direct feeding on the plants. So what's the current status with this one? Well, I think as you probably know, it is found throughout the state. I've shown you the graphs and the maps. This year, um, we actually saw declines in some parts of New Jersey. In the areas that I was working with this insect right on campus in New Brunswick and over on the Livingston campus, we saw declines in numbers. And this is typical for an invasive species where they move into an area, they reach high populations, and then they disperse out into new areas and decline in the original areas. What's different is how long that actually takes. Um, that could be partly due to people removing tree of heaven in the environment on their properties and whatnot. Because in the fall, that's what they're feeding on, in addition to the grapes. That is one of the things that I would recommend if people want to try to get them off their property, is to remove the tree of heaven there. We don't recommend that you spray all your plants um, in the property that they're feeding on anymore. It doesn't really do any good. Um, Getting them when removing the tree of heaven. And you can also treat the tree of heaven with a systemic insecticide. And so if you start to see the adults and you've got tree of heaven, the recommendation is you cut down most of the trees, but leave some of the female trees for them to congregate and feed on. Um, and the idea is you treat it with a systemic insecticide. And so when they feed, they pick up a lethal dose and they die, and you can help start to reduce the populations. But again, this isn't going to be something that you can do yourselves because the material is a neonicotinoid insecticide. It's actually dinotefuran that is used. And again, as you know, the general public, we're not allowed to buy that anymore. But just like the specimen trees, um, the state is considering giving emergency exemptions so that companies can offer that service to people to treat their tree of heaven and tree of heaven only with the insecticide. Sal, how am I doing on time? Okay, let's move to the last one. This is the northern giant hornet. Um, you know it's a giant hornet because of the coloration. And that is the big thing here. That orange head makes this different from any of the other hornets that we have here in New Jersey. And so when this first was talked about as coming into the Pacific Northwest for the first time, people were concerned, and of course the press helped with that, um, making us feel like this was going to come here. So it has lots of different names. Asian giant hornet, Japanese giant hornet, aka the murder hornet. That's another one that's been used. When it was first introduced into the United States, we were calling it the Asian giant hornet. We've now changed that to the northern giant hornet. Um, we have a national entomology society that develops the common names we use for insects here in the U.S. And so they didn't like the reference to Asian in the name, and so they've renamed it Northern Giant Hornet, and so that's what we call it today. And you can see a person here holding it with their probably holding the wings between their fingers. I'm going to guess that that's a male, and I'll tell you why in a second. It is the world's largest hornet. It thrives in temperate and tropical areas, and it's native to East Asia, South Asia, mainland Southeast Asia, and parts of Russia in the far east. Um, it was found in the Pacific Northwest in Washington State in 2019, um, and they had additional sightings in 2020. And in 2021, they actually found nests. And so they were very concerned about this spreading. And this is a map that was developed based on temperatures and other aspects of the environment in that area, how fast it might spread. And so within 20 years, they were estimating that it could potentially spread well into British Columbia and down into the southern part along the coast of Oregon. So just a couple of interesting facts. It's not aggressive. That's a misnomer about this insect. It's not aggressive unless you provoke it. It's kind of like a bald-faced hornet. If you throw a rock at the nest, they're going to come after you. So you just disturb the nest, they're going to come after you. Like a lot of the hornets, they make these papery nests that chew wood products and turn it into a pulp and make their nest in cavities. And so I mentioned that the males, that was probably a male, and that's because the male of Hymenoptera actually don't have stings. They can't sting you. It's only the females that have the stinger. The big threat to these is to the apiculture industry, the beekeepers, because these wasps are notorious for attacking honeybee nests and hives and killing all the honeybees and running off with all the resources for their own food that are in those hives. Now this is the European hornet, and right off the bat you should notice that that head is not orange. It's more of a yellowish brown color. This is the largest hornet in Europe. And so it's been here in the United States and North America since 1840. So it's been here for a very long time. This one is aggressive, although you still have to disturb it, before the females will sting. Again, they make paper-like nests. You can see a picture of one here in the cavity of a hollow tree. Like many hornets, we have queens that overwinter. That's their overwintering stage. Right before it gets real cold, the nest will produce queens that will mate, and then they leave the nest, go off and find a place to basically hibernate for the wintertime. And then when they emerge out of that in the springtime, they then go off and they start new nests. They don't really go back to the original nest. They rear a brood of workers, and the female does all of the feeding and tending, and then from that throughout the rest of the summer, she continues to lay eggs, and the workers, just like in honeybees, do the work. They take care of the young, they go out and get the food, and then in the fall, they create a generation of queens that are going to overwinter again and make it to the next spring. European hornets are mostly predatory. They feed on insects, although they do feed on sugary substances. And so spotted lanternfly enters the picture here because of all that large amounts of sugary fluid that it excretes. When they're in large numbers on trees, especially on tree of heaven, they can attract a large number of the hornets. And so you have to be a little careful when that's going on. Here's a face-to-face, the European hornet versus the northern giant hornet. And again, you can see there's a big difference between that face. One's orange and black, and the other is a little reddish, and it's got yellow and a little bit of orange on the mandibles and brownish eyes. The other one that people are confusing this with is the eastern cicada killer wasp. Again, this is a wasp. It is a fairly large wasp. It is at least as big as the European hornet. It's not quite as big as the northern giant hornet. And they do kind of resemble very large yellow jackets. They're about 2 inches long. They are solitary. They don't make nests in terms of being like a hive. The adults feed on nectar, and the males are very territorial. And so in areas where they have lots of them making nest holes in sandy soils, you'll see a lot of these males early in the season when this starts patrolling the area, and it looks like they're defending those nests. And what they're really doing is establishing a territory to attract a female so that they can mate. And again, they can't sting you, so they can't hurt you. They are, I guess, considered to be beneficial because they do, and I have a picture here of a female that's dragging a cicada, the annual cicadas that we have every year, to their hole in the ground. The females sting the cicadas, and that paralyzes them. And then they take them back to their nest hole, bring it down into the nest. They lay an egg on it. That egg hatches, and then that cicada becomes the food for the young. Now these are out in July and August, and so it coincides with when the annual cicadas are out here in the east. They are not around at the time of year with the 17-year cicadas, and so they don't have any impact on those. Here's a picture of a nest. Okay, that top picture is from a fairway, and so they will dig into the soil, and the dirt mounds up, and you can see another picture there on the bottom of the mound. This is a problem on a golf course, and so they don't want these to be around. We also get calls from homeowners that have sandy soils, and they have that situation where they have lots of holes, and they've got all those males, and they want to treat for that. And we really don't recommend that that be done. They like sunny areas, and again, they may build those nests communally. Here's a comparison of the northern giant hornet there on the bottom and cicada killers. And we actually have 3 species here in North America. The one there that's labeled cicada killer is the eastern one, and then there's a Pacific cicada killer and a western cicada killer that look much different than the one we have here in the east. And again, if you look at that eastern one in the Asian giant hornet, the colors are different and the patterns are different. And so here's a comparison of the 3 with the northern giant hornet in the middle with the big yellow head, and we're looking down from the top. And if you look at the abdomen, which is this area from here to here, it has a series of stripes of alternating orangey yellow and brown on the abdomen. And compare that to the European hornet, where it has black stripes and yellow, and they call this a drip pattern. The coloration of the brown bands kind of looks like water is dripping down the abdomen. And then compare that over here to the eastern cicada killer, where the bands are, the abdomen's primarily black with yellow. And again, not as many as the European hornet, but still has some of these strip marks. And then the tip of the abdomen is solid black. as opposed to the other two. So current status, no confirmed sightings since 2021. They are still looking. However, they think that they've gotten all the individuals that they've got there. They are looking at ports of entry. They are looking in the field. That's one of the traps that they're using. That's basically a plastic bottle that has orange juice in the bottom of it as an attractant, because they do like sugary material. And so they're keeping an eye on this, and they're also keeping an eye on the Northwest beekeeping industry, doing a lot of outreach with the apiculturists, so that they can keep an eye out for this as well, and if they see it, to let them know. And so this is my closing slide, and if we want to pull up the chat, I'll take any questions that might be there, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
I'm having a little bit of trouble with my camera, but I can read some questions. Let me just, not sure what's going on with it. Let me just turn off my camera. Okay, we have a bunch of questions with, because people do like insects. And everyone, I did launch the poll.
Yep,
So if you
I can
would
see
go
it.
ahead and if you would go ahead and fill that out. Okay, so we've got lots of questions about the various topics that you spoke about. Okay, here's a question on spotted lanternfly. Are the quarantines effective at all? Seems from your maps that they may not be.
I will say probably not, and there's a reason for that. Many of you might know what a Japanese beetle is. We have quarantines here in New Jersey for Japanese beetle. It's basically so that we don't ship nursery stock to other parts of the country that don't have it. And there is a mandatory program where things going into a non-quarantine area, we have inspectors with the Department of Agriculture that inspect the shipments, and just so that they make sure that we're not shipping any beetles, because the beetles, they lay their eggs and the larvae live in the containers of the nursery stock. And so the grower has to either produce a certificate that says they sprayed them, or they get inspected and they may end up spraying anyway. So that's a mandatory program. With the spotted lanternfly, the quarantines with not moving and checking your vehicles before you do, and things that are on the vehicles, it is a voluntary program here in New Jersey. And so, if people don't do it, that's how it gets spread around. And so I would say it's probably they had an impact, but they're not 100%. Wasn't 100%.
Okay. Again, with the spotted lanternfly, do the current drought conditions affect them at all? Do they need a water source other than like plant sap?
Well, that is something that's being discussed, as whether the decline we saw was due to the 90-degree temperatures and lack of rain that we saw this summer. Um, I don't know about everybody else, but my lawn is brown. And so trees are impacted by lack of rain as well. If they don't have the capability of getting fluids into them through the roots, to replace what transpires out of the leaves and so forth, they get impacted by drought as well. And so that them not having lots of fluid in their systems could have impacted the spotted lanternfly. That's a good question.
When you're talking about using insecticides, on the host trees. Does doing that affect, say, birds that might eat those insects and also other predators, insect predators, for example?
I wouldn't think that they would be harming any of the birds, although I can't say that for 100%. It is a possibility that maybe other predatory insects, if there was a toxic dose in the lanternfly themselves, because it's systemic, so it's going to be in their system. Um, that is a possibility. The main thing we worry about, though, with the systemic materials are actually honeybees, which is why we have the ban. And so when they get the waiver, the dinotefuran is what it will be allowed to use, not the midacloprid, which is the other one, because it doesn't stay in the tree and end up in the flowers and the nectar in the springtime.
Jumping to the emerald ash borer, I'm getting a lot of. Are you hearing that feedback, George, on
Sounds
the
like
audio?
it sounds like well, I hear a fan, but it might be the fan on my computer, on my laptop.
Oh, interesting. Okay, with the emerald ash borer, is there any way you can trim off like dead branches and get rid of those? Or
I'm not sure that that's going to have a whole lot of impact because they will, if they're in the top of the tree, if it's not the initial infestation, they're going to move down the tree pretty quickly.
um, and if there are felled trees, do the emerald ash borers are they still able to use that to complete their life cycle?
Okay, so the ones that are in the tree are going to be probably be able to complete their life cycle. But that tree, once it's dead, it's not going to be giving off the volatile compounds that they use to find their host trees.
Is there a government agency in New Jersey, for example, that's responsible for ensuring that firewood is free from any of these insects, or maybe enforcing rules about moving firewood?
Initially, that was done by the Department of Agriculture. And so they actually had companies that they certified were capable of doing the chipping. That if you cut down your trees and you wanted to dispose of them, you were supposed to use. But I'm not sure that now that it's statewide that that's what they're doing. They were doing that to try and keep it from getting into other counties.
Okay. Here's kind of a fun question, or maybe it's just a comment, but it's interesting that it's okay to use the term European for one hornet, but not the term Asian for another hornet.
Yes, I know. In our national society, we're having this debate. So, if you've ever heard of gypsy moth, we no longer call it gypsy moth; we call it spongy moth. And so, eventually, I think that all our common names that have similar types of, those kinds of connotations are going to eventually get changed. But, things move slowly. They have to come up with a new name.
That's very true. We'll have to know. We all have to get caught up on all these new common names as well, or we
Right.
could just use the scientific names and not worry about the common names so much.
That's actually what we have to do in our publications when there isn't an approved common name. And there are lots of insects that don't have approved common names.
There's a question about nematodes. Are nematodes used at all considering these insects? So
Uh, it's a possibility that there could be some animal pathogenic nematodes out there that might attack these insects, but there's nothing that I know of commercially that's being sold for that.
would the idea be that they would be like soil borne and then get into the plant and then attack the insects?
Well, they could be. Well, no, I'm gonna back up a minute. So most of the nematodes that are on the market, they're for controlling things like Oriental beetle and Japanese beetle and those types of insects, and they're all soil borne, and that's because you can maintain a moisture level. Um, I'm thinking that at least some research has been done to try and use nematodes, and I forget which species it was, as a foliar application to try and control spotted lanternfly in grapes, I believe.
Okay. Jumping back to the spotted lanternfly, can you, I guess, can you clarify with the systemic neonicotinoids? They're not available for homeowners. Are they available for commercial companies that could treat it?
Okay, so actually, um, the law actually states that neonicotinoids are not available for sale or use here in New Jersey, except in certain circumstances. Um, so the landscapers can't use it, homeowners can't use it. There is an exclusion for pest control companies if they want to use it as a couple of foot perimeter spray for insects that might invade a house. They can do that. The only group other than that has a major one is agriculture. And so, wine grape growers, if they had them in their vineyard, they can spray it. It's just the rest of us can't do that. And so the state and the law has a section in it that says this can be done, can do what the DEP can approve an emergency exemption, and they can do this on a yearly basis. And so that they're actually in the process of trying to get the first one. And two of the insects that they're talking about, for specimen trees and for only the spraying tree of heaven to control lanternflies that might be attracted. Um, we'll probably have that next spring. But again, that's only going to be for the companies to be able to do that.
And that would be something that the arborist company would apply for in those
Yeah, yeah.
cases.
I am pretty sure that there'll probably be some kind of approval. So the state will say, okay, we've got this exemption, and then they'll have to go and say, I would like to be able to do this.
Okay, I think this is the final question. When you were talking about the need to chip the wood or burn the wood, chip it down to 1 inch or less, is that something you could tell your tree service company to do?
Okay.
Yep.
Well, if you're going to cut down an ash tree because it's got emerald ash borer, I would actually, before you have it done, ask the company if they have that capability to do that. Because when they cut down a tree, they run it through, and they don't normally leave. They take it off, and I don't know what they do to dispose of the chippings. They probably got a chip pile that they dump it all. And that's what the worry is. And the size is that's small enough that when it's chipped, it should grind up all the larvae that are in the that's in the wood.
Right, right. Um, okay, one more question, I think. Um, do hornets prefer certain trees for their cavity nests?
No, no.
Okay.
Uh, cavities. That's what they like.
Okay. Any place that looks homey.
Yeah, I actually a couple of years ago had a female that was trying. She figured out a way to get into my shed where I keep my lawn equipment and was trying to create a nest in there. So that's a big cavity. So, they're looking for a secluded spot to be able to do that.
All right. So I think there we will wrap up the question portion. Thanks everyone for submitting questions. We had quite a few, and I apologize if I did miss any. I think I got them all. And I would like to thank everyone for being here tonight. That was a great talk, George. Uh, from my perspective, quite interesting and right up my alley. And so thanks everyone, and good night. And we will see you next week on Tuesday, I believe, will be our final Earth Day every day for this fall season.
And Sal, I apologize for running over.
No worries. You had lots of questions to deal with. Okay, thanks everyone. Good night.
Yep.